deep snow for an hour to get to the nearest slope. When they got there, John noticed that at the start of the slope there was a sign with a black diamond and a skull and crossbones on it. The hill itself looked to him as if it went down at about an 85-degree angle. Now, he'd been looking for something more adventurous, it's true, but this was a little bit much. Still, he didn't have much choice. He had to get down to the bottom. There was only one way down. Then he got the only skiing lesson he'd ever gotten in his whole life. Hans said to John, as John had just said to his own wife not that long ago, "Don't look down." "You're going to be frightened by the slope," Hans told him, "and overwhelmed by the distance. When new skiers look down, they panic. And when they face straight ahead on a slope this steep, well then Hans made a whistling sound and made a hand motion that was pretty easy for John to interpret. "I think you can make it," Hans said, though John really didn't like the way he said the word think. "Just remember one thing," Hans went on. "Don't look down." John went on to describe what he admits must have been the ugliest ski run of all time. However, through it all, he said, "Don't look down" became his #1 rule of life. No matter what happened, he did not look down. He wrote that 6-year-old children skied between his legs as he went along just to get him to watch them. But he didn't. He didn't look down. People skied past him, took the lift back up, and skied past him again just to see how many times they could lap him. Still, he did not look down. He said he probably set a record for the number of zigzag turns made in one slope on one day. But he did not look down. No matter what, no matter how scared he was, no matter what was going on around him, John did not look down. In fact, he became the expert of not looking down, he said. And that is what got him to the bottom of the hill in one piece. He did not look down. That advice is good advice for us today. And in a way, is what I wonder if Jesus was getting at in the gospel lesson that we just heard. Today is a very special day in the church. It's the beginning of a brand new church year. Just like there is a calendar year that begins on January 1st and an academic year that begins in August or September, the church has its own way of keeping track of time too. And for the church, the year begins today. It's also the beginning of a season that we call Advent, a time the church sets aside to help us get ready for Christmas and to remind us that Christ has come and is coming again, and that we are always waiting for him to come again. Often, the idea that Christ is returning is an idea that inspires disturbing thoughts about the quote-unquote end of the world, which will show up with things like violence and judgment and other things we heard in the gospel, like the sky turning dark. These can be frightening images, and they also can be distractions from the message of what Christ's return is supposed to be about. Remember, the Gospels that talk about Jesus as someone who is bringing God's kingdom to us just by being present with us. God's kingdom here on earth, as we heard in the Gospels, was about things like what Jesus showed. The poor being fed, the sick being made well, the outcasts restored to community. This concept is what inspires us to keep doing the work of Christ. And it's also what is promised the whole world will be like when Christ returns. This is also a mystery, something that's not necessarily easy to understand, and sometimes it's even harder to believe. And that's because there are a lot of things going on in our lives, whether they are happening with us or with those who live in our neighborhoods, in our communities, in the state, or the country, or maybe right even here in this parish, that could contradict that message. Some days it just seems like everything is just terrible. Things like unemployment and underemployment continuing to be a problem. There are many sick people who are not getting well. Violence seems to be growing and spreading, and not just in places like Ferguson, but in other places all over our country. The list could go on and on and on. Sometimes there seems to be no good news. Some days it seems like there is no hope. best thing to do is to not look down. Sometimes it seems like the times are growing more violent. Don't look down. Sometimes it might seem like illnesses are not getting better. Don't look down. Sometimes it seems like there are more rejections than opportunities. Don't look down. Okay, so if we're not supposed to look down, then what are we supposed to focus on? The answer to that question is not only what the season of Advent, but our whole life can be about. Our focus is to be on Christ. Because He is the one who can and does bring hope. Hope that's deeper than simply wishing things will get better. Hope that assures us that we're not alone, no matter what we encounter in life. Remember, Advent is a time that reminds us we are waiting for Christ who has come and is coming again. The church here doesn't begin with this great big celebration. It begins quietly, with the lighting of a single candle. It begins with waiting and acknowledging our waiting, in order to acknowledge all the waiting we are doing that's part of life. Not just, waiting for a traffic light to turn green or when we're waiting in line. Advent is about the kind of waiting that the person who is ill is doing while they wait for healing. Or the person who is unemployed is doing while they wait for a job. Or the person who longs for a spouse is doing. Or what a parish waiting for a priest or a priest waiting for a parish is doing. None of that waiting is passive, and there are things these people need to do while we wait. And also, we have to be aware there are lots of distractions that can be tempting, because the kind of waiting that we're doing can be unpleasant, and who doesn't want to break from it now and then? But if we end up focusing on those distractions, whatever they are, things like gossip or entertainment, other people's drama, violence, or whatever happens to be on the news, then we miss the good advice of Jesus. Don't look down. This doesn't mean we ignore what goes on around us, far from it. It just means we don't let those things distract us from keeping our focus on Christ, that He is with us. If John had given into the distractions while skiing down that overwhelming run, he might not have made it down the hill without some serious bruises or even broken bones. Instead, he kept his focus. He didn't look down. Jesus' words of warning or advice are a good reminder for us today as we continue to wait while we prepare for Christmas. Now, that can be a lot of fun, getting ready for Christmas, with lots of very enjoyable tasks like shopping and baking and decorating and all those other great things that we do. But and those things, by the way, can help us gain insight in our waiting and help us recognize those signs that Christ is coming. Or they can become distractions if we focus too much on them. And then they might leave us empty and exhausted after our Christmas celebrations instead of feeling full of God's love in Christ. So as this new year begins for the church, and as we enter this time of preparing for Christmas, of waiting for Christ, as we wait for all the other things in our lives, maybe we can start by practicing Jesus' advice and not look down and keep our focus on Him. One way we could do that maybe is we could write the words, "Don't look down," on a post-it note or a piece of paper and put it on our doors to remind us whenever we leave our homes that no matter what we encounter during the day, we are not going to look down, we're going to keep our focus on Christ. Or maybe we could just light a candle every day, whether it's in our own Advent wreath at home or just a candle you might have. Or just sit quietly for 1 minute, or maybe say a prayer, or however it works for you, to remind yourself this special season called Advent, to keep our focus on Christ, on what His love looks like. And no matter how busy we get or what comes up, we can always remember